In your opinion, what is the method to study industrial relations? What are the limits of the empiric method?
Right. Well, first of all, there is no one method, because industrial relations, certainly as I see it, is a multidisciplinary approach to studying a very complicated area of social reality. It's a multi-level manner of investigation and research. It may look at the experience of individual workers, it may look at the global economic system, and at any of the levels between that. So that adds to the complexity. And then, of course, as in any subject area, there are competing paradigms, competing approaches to analysis. And ideally, the competition between different approaches to understanding is fertile and inspires development and change. So there are many different methods, none of which is unique and none of which is alone valid. The empirical method, the study ought to be empirical in the sense it should be looking at concrete reality. But it has to be more than that, because otherwise simply gathering facts is like stamp collecting. It doesn't have much contribution to understanding. So one has to have an idea of what facts one wants to examine, and then one has to explain them, and all that involves theoretical development. So empirical analysis and theory shouldn't be seen as opposites, they go hand in hand. There was a wonderful book back in the 1950s, I think, by Wright Mills called The Sociological Imagination. I don't know if anyone reads it these days.
But
it's a very important discussion of precisely these issues.
The second question, what is the role of industrial relations in capitalist society? Nowadays, can we still talk about class conflict or structural antagonism into the capital-employment relationship?
Well, the implication of a capitalist society is that what is a cost for the worker, the effort involved, can be a benefit for the employer, and what is a cost for the employer can be a benefit for the worker. So that is what is meant, I think, by structured antagonism. Of course, things are not quite as straightforward as that. Any social analysis has to look at complexity and try to provide ways of understanding it that simplify to some extent and therefore oversimplify. But it seems to me that this notion of antagonistic interests is still valid, and that is why industrial relations is very much an approach to understanding these conflicts and to some extent how they can be mediated and institutionalized. Now, I think a very important point to make is that to some extent in the years around and after the Second World War, there were important institutions which helped contain and control this conflict and antagonism. And there was an outcome in terms of increased employment rights for workers, in terms of a reduction in inequalities. What we've seen in the last few decades is the reverse of that inequality has increased, work for many people has become much more precarious, and employers have new ways of monitoring, surveying and disciplining workers. So in that sense you could say the antagonism has increased, and in the most recent period after the economic crisis and then with COVID and now with the war in Ukraine, that imposes high social costs, and those again tend to be imposed particularly on the weakest in society rather than on the strongest. So in that sense, yes, that whole idea of class antagonism is still very valid.
And the last question is, why study the origins of collective bargaining and its evolution path? What are the cues for the present and the possible future developments of industrial relations?
Someone once said, those who don't understand the past are condemned to repeat it. One can't simply learn lessons from history, but to understand how we got where we are and what are the trends and what are the drivers of those trends is an essential part of thinking, how do we proceed in the future? Now, the question of what these futures will be, clearly the future is not predetermined. About 10 years ago, I wrote an article in which I talked about 3 scenarios for industrial relations, one of which was what I call going from bad to worse, which I thought was probably the most plausible. There's a recent book by Nancy Fraser called Cannibal Capitalism, which argues that the development of the global economy, the role of financialization in increasingly motivating and driving what is happening is actually destructive of the very foundations of society. And I think there's a lot to show that that is still the dominant trend. A second scenario I suggested was elite reform, trying to contain things, but I don't see much sign of elites having a plan for making things better. And the third scenario, borrowing from Polanyi's work on the history of capitalist economies, was that we could see what he called a counter movement in which people get together to try to reverse these trends and make things better. The problem, it seems to me, is that today the counter movements which are occurring tend to be not progressive but reactionary. In many countries, the rise of the far right. Here in Italy, of course, 8 decades after Mussolini, government once more controlled by fascists. And this means there's a great challenge in thinking, how can we have a counter movement which is different in character, which is progressive? There are no easy answers. What I would say is that as scholars, as intellectuals, we also have an obligation to try to contribute to a different future. And that part of the role that we pursue should be to suggest how things might be improved, how there could be a more positive response to the current challenges, and how we can inform and assist actors whose projects are progressive rather than reactionary.
So, thank you very much.
A pleasure.